Thank you, everybody. It's lovely to be here. It's very nice to be here. I'll say more about how nice it is to be here later on. I'm Tim Hosgood. I'm from the Topos Institute. I'm going to talk to you about open translations in mathematics, which it's undetermined at this stage in the talk what the word open means. That's something I hope to discuss. And I'll show you in a minute the plan of what I intend to talk about. I want to start with the caveat, which is that I am just a mathematician. I am not a historian of mathematics. I am not a professional translator. I am not even like natively bilingual. I'm just a maths guy who likes translating stuff. So this whole talk is coming from my experience, the kind of things I've seen in the community efforts I've been involved in the past, in the sort of technical aspects of translation, in the technological aspects of translation. But all of this is really just a chance to sort of like start a conversation amongst ourselves. I'm not claiming any sort of expertise on anything at all. I just want to say briefly where I'm from, actually. So I'm with the Topos Institute, which is this new mission-driven non-profit research institute here in the UK. One reason I mention this is because actually while writing this talk, I realized how relevant this talk was actually to some of the stuff that I'm doing. So the Topos Institute is a mathematical research institute. We do a lot of category theory, and we do it applied to systems science and systems technology. So the aim is to, well, the mission's been cut off a little bit, but it's to realize a world where the systems that surround us benefit us all. So it's much about like pluralistic, democratic technological uses. One of the big things we focus on is actually collaborative scientific modeling. And something we've learned about collaborative scientific modeling recently is that some previous attempts towards doing multi-domain, I promise this is relevant, between doing like multi-domain scientific modeling where you have a biologist and a chemist and an ecologist and an economist in the same room trying to build a COVID model, for example, is that all of those people speak very different technical languages. And it's actually kind of a lost cause to try to take what might be a mathematician's approach and go, all we need to do is find some super language that expresses all of their capabilities in which everybody can communicate. This turns out to be bad. It reduces your domain specificity, it reduces the technical capability of your language, and it suggests that what we should maybe do instead of trying to build one universal language, is just get better at translation between domain-specific languages. And that's really sort of the like thesis of my talk here today, if there is one, is that this fact, which to me in the past has seemed like a problem, right? Like there are specific papers from the 1970s written in German that are key to my research, and I cannot read them because I don't speak German. And that's really frustrating to me because I think they solve research problems that I have. This to me has always seemed like a problem. And when I was younger and more naive, even more naive than I am now, I used to believe like, okay, all we need to do is like get everyone, we'll formalize these things, maybe we'll stick them in a proof system, we'll do something to get them so that they're like universally encoded so everyone can read them. And now I've got a little bit older, much older, and a little bit less naive, I'm starting to believe that actually this is really something we should see as a plus and as a benefit. What we should get better at is this sort of like intralingual translation that we end up doing. And if anything, we should be promoting more content to be created in more languages. I claim that that would be a much better outcome. In short, I would like more of these things to happen, not fewer. I don't want the goal to be that over, decades or whatever, we sit down and translate everything and then we're done. I would love to create more work that we can ever actually possibly solve. So here's what I'm going to talk about today in the talk. I'm going to talk about 5 things, kind of briefly in each. I'm going to talk a little bit about translation in the context of science, as opposed to literary translation or other types of translation. I'm going to say a little bit about some of the previous projects I've worked on, which seems like it doesn't have a purpose beyond me just telling you things I've done. But I've picked out 3 projects I've worked on that sort of highlight different difficulties in different types of mathematical translations and different community sizes and different contexts. Then I'm going to talk a bit about some useful tools that I've found along the way, which probably likely are well known to many of you, maybe not. It's, if anything, more of a stepping stone to talk about number 5. In part 4, I'll talk about some difficulties that I've encountered specifically, both in terms of sort of the translation side and the community side. And then at the end, future resources is where I talk about what I would, in my dream world, would like to see sort of appear in the next however many years as things to make translation a more accessible and more community endeavor. Does anyone have any questions at this point, just about this one slide? Okay, fantastic. So let me start by talking a little bit about translation in the context of science. I Googled quotes about translation, because this is how you start any talk, right? You give a dictionary definition, or you find a good quote or whatever. And I found this one, which is, I think, on a surface level, a great quote. The more I think about it, it's a terrible quote. And I would just like for people to just decide how they feel about this quote. Translation is that which transforms everything so that nothing changes. I think that's lovely if true, but the if is doing a lot of lifting there. Something that comes up if you start thinking about scientific translation, and something that I've encountered a little bit. I'm not going to pretend I've had strong community pushback against doing translations, but there is this idea that scientific or technological or technical or specific translations is much simpler than translating poetry, for example. It's definitely less subjective, it's much simpler, you just need the technical language and you're done. I would claim, and I don't think I'm going to get much pushback from this audience, that that's not true. I would say that these things are equally difficult, they just highlight different aspects of the difficulty of translation. So there are some books I will point to, but also the rest of this talk, I hope, shows that actually, that's not quite true, and hopefully the rest of this fortnight will also show that that's not quite true as well. And I will come back to this point a little bit later on. So some of the things you come across when doing scientific translation, which again I'm sure are familiar to many of you, there are lots of little questions. So I've just picked some that I came across. I've been working on a translation by Charles Erisman recently. I'll talk about that one in a bit. And see some of the things I came across while I was writing it, that all of these questions that I've picked are ones where for some translations I've decided yes, and for some I've decided no, for most of these questions. So to me they're genuine questions in that they don't have a concrete, specific single answer. So one which I've come across a lot is when you have notation which is specific to a language. In French they use ENS to denote the category of sets. We use set in English because it's set. Do you translate that or not? Yes, so that readers can understand. But no, so that readers can actually find the sentence you're talking about and read a theorem out of context and know that ends is equal to set. If there are typos, a big one is misnumberings, which is really fun. I've translated a few papers of Deline where there are two theorem 2.1.7s. What do you do? One of them should be 2.1.8, because the next one is 2.1.9. Do I fix it to make future people trying to find 2.1.7 confused, or do I not? A bigger one is what if you find mathematical mistakes? And here it's not so likely, well, depending on what you're reading, but it's maybe not so likely that you yourself find a mistake, but if future errata have been published, do you correct the mathematical mistakes in line? Do you include them as footnotes? Do you include the errata? What do you do with this? A small one is what about the bibliography? Quite often when you look at French algebraic geometry from the 60s and 70s, which is mostly what I do, you find that my favorite citation, I should have included a photo, is there's bibliography by Deline where it just says, the citation is Deline Secret Papers, which isn't very useful as a reference to have. Now we actually know to which papers these were referencing. They weren't that secret after all. And quite often you see things to be published or preprint in preparation with no name. If we now know the name, should we go back and insert it or not? Is this introducing some sort of anachronism into our translations? A big one that I will talk about is ambiguous sentences. Sometimes sentences are confusing. They might just be sloppily written. It might just be that actually there's an ambiguity that wasn't clear at the time. What is your role as a translator in terms of editor? Do you have a role or not there? What if notation and terminology has changed? This is a big one I've seen again in the Erisman paper. Do you update it? The biggest one I've seen is the use of an arrow, so in LaTeX like a backslash right arrow versus a backslash maps to. So this arrow with like a bar at the end of it to use what actually happens to elements under a function. This really wasn't in use back in the 60s and 70s in a lot of French papers, but nowadays a modern reader would be confused by seeing the normal arrow used for both. So should you update this or not? A big one, which is why, and you'll find it very much in letters, that it's not true that maths is just a sequence of series and symbols on a page. Actually, it turns out that there are usually words in the paper as well, and those words were written by a person, and that person had a character. So it's quite interesting to decide how you're going to translate the prose between these sort of things. How much are you going to try to do a literary translation? Especially, sorry, go back to this. Oh no. Wait. Sorry, my laptop's frozen. Here we go. Especially if you're translating certain things by particularly like floral authors in some sense. Something that this is more of a personal thing that I find when I write mathematics, I'm usually quite formulaic in my approach to writing mathematics. If I use a word once, I try to use the same word again if the sentence surrounding it is the same in some sense. You know, I like little formulaic sentences. If A, then B, the next time I'm not going to write, well, maybe if then A, comma, then B. You know, I try to be a little bit formulaic. Some authors are not. How much do you let your personal neuroses get in the way of your translation efforts? So this comes back to this one. If you're translating Bourbaki, this is super easy because every sentence feels kind of the same. If you're translating something else, this is not true at all. One thing you should look about is like, how specific to the author is the vocabulary, how specific to the time in which it was written is the vocabulary, and how specific to the language. If you read, again, French stuff written in the 60s and 70s, essentially every single proof starts with en effet. Every single proof starts with this. And in my first translations, I would translate this as indeed, of course, thus, or something every single time, trying to find a new different filler word, until I realized that actually in English, this doesn't serve the same, like, we don't need this, okay? This is something that is very much like typical to that time and that language. English doesn't have something that is as typical in that time and that language. So maybe the best translation is just to avoid those things entirely. And there are many more. I suppose maybe for the sake of interaction, it would be interesting to ask if anyone has anything else that they would consider adding to this list that they think is as pertinent. Yes?
Well, one massive problem that we keep encountering are these super long sentences
Yes.
that go on for lines and lines, and then we always doubt, should we break this up? Because otherwise it just becomes unreadable in English.
Yes. So in some senses, it's like,
debate that we keep having.
exactly. So your question is like, where is this? It's nice to imagine that there's such a thing as a translator and an editor, but actually I don't think translator exists on its own. Or you have to decide beforehand where along the line you want to sit. This is another big one. Like length of sentences is definitely a good one, yes. Yes?
Two remarks. In the text we are translating, there are two authors.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, they haven't written together, but they have written distinct parts.
Yes.
So the question is, should we, when we speak of the vocabulary specific to the author, okay. Now, something strikes me, that is that one may want to use statistical tools applied to the text to identify, for instance, formulaic expressions and so on, to be systematic if we want to be formulaic when the authors are formulaic.
Okay, yeah, this is a really interesting point, and not one that I've considered, actually, the idea of using like statistical methods. I think I will pick up on that one later, but I will say for now, it's very interesting, this thing about having like two authors within a single text. It's something that, so I'll talk about this later, about this thing of sort of like editorial consistency whenever you do a community translation, because this problem is amplified by the fact that, especially here, it's not one person doing a translation. So how do you ensure some sort of consistency between what's produced as well? Okay, good. I'm very excited to see. So yeah, well, actually, I'll talk about it in a sec, but this is the largest in-person group I've ever seen doing this stuff. So this is fantastic. Okay, I want to just point to something a little bit before. I promise I will actually talk about translations of mathematics, but I just want to talk about something interesting, which again, I don't think I need to convince people in this room of, which is the idea that maybe English, as this sort of lingua franca of mathematics, is not the sort of utopia scientific world of which we dream. So there's this really good article by Adam Hutner-Cross called English, a Hegemony, and I just wanted to include two short quotes from here. The one that I really want to pick up on is this top one, which is, it says, in short, scientists who want to produce influential, globally recognized work most likely need to publish in English, which means they'll also have to attend English language conferences, read English language papers, and have English language discussions. This is a massive barrier to entry for a lot of the world, okay? Especially having English language conferences hosted in countries which are generally incredibly tight with their visa regulations for non-English countries. And the second one is also very interesting, which is talking about this domain collapse, which is how a language stops adapting to changes in a given field if not used. and it can eventually cease to be an effective means of communication in certain contexts altogether. I raise this because actually I think this comes up later on in one of my slides, so I'll try to call back to this. But I would say this is a fantastic article. Yes?
One has to establish that this may be true, that a language stops adapting. I don't believe in the existence of such a thing.
Okay, that's very interesting. I have multiple thoughts on this.
She lives in France.
Yes, so there I was going to say, so there's a big context here of France and Germany and Italy to some sense are very special. For sure, I recognize, so I did my PhD in France, I very much recognize the specificity of the...
I don't think this has something...
No, I understand. No, so this is something I think will be an interesting discussion. So for example, I used to 100% believe this, and then as we will see, I received some emails from some professors in northern Spain who sent me a Basque mathematical dictionary, which had incredibly technical language in it. So I was like, oh wow, fantastic. And then recently, I tried to find some resources on category theory in Arabic, and I cannot find a single one beyond the Wikipedia page. So I'm not even sure what level of language exists in Arabic to talk about category theory. I would love for someone to tell me. If this talk gets put on the internet, I'm sure someone will email me, so that's fantastic. I would love to be corrected, but I don't think there is that language in Arabic at the moment, the technical specificity. One fantastic talk was given by Min-Hyung Kim, who's now up at ICMS in Edinburgh, who gave a talk on the question of identity, which was just, again, I think something that was very interesting. His sort of opening question was, were there any Roman mathematicians? And then he gave this very interesting talk about, well, I'm not going to try to summarize the whole talk in an hour, but he gave a very specific part which was about language in which mathematicians publish corresponding to their nationality and how history perceives them. So a good one he gave was the example of Al-Biruni, who calculated the radius of the Earth, and depending on who you ask and when you ask them, his nationality is undetermined. He talks about why there were no Roman mathematicians, by which he means sort of like Roman Empire mathematicians, and this was in response to some like mathematical historians in England in the early 1900s who were speaking about how, you know, the moment that Pythagoras was slain, the Romans took over with their order, and the Greek beauty of mathematics was lost, and the Roman strategic sort of formulaic engineering approach won over in all of this. And he wanted to push back against this a little bit. I highly recommend you watch the talk because he actually knows about history. He gave this quote by Thomas Jefferson talking about black people in America, which the irony was very much not lost on Min-Hyung here, where Jefferson writes, one could scarcely be found capable of tracing them, being capable of tracing and comprehending the investigations of Euclid. And as Min-Hyung points out, nobody actually knows anything about Euclid's ethnicity at all. We just know that they probably lived in Africa for most of their life, and that's about it historically. But the language in which they publish has led us to determine certain conclusions. He gave a lot of examples of other mathematicians who we seem to associate with a specific place, but actually, again, it's just the language in which they publish because it was the lingua franca of the time. And he ended this talk with a great quote, which is that said, in the future, we will all be included in a book on the global history of English written by a future historian, irrelevant of what language we speak and irrelevant of what country we're from, because this is the language of mathematics today. This is the sort of end of my like social part of this talk, where I just want to say that doing these translations into English, I think is fantastic. It's what I do. I love it. But one thing I would like to start moving more into is I think when we translate something into English, we pick a text, we pick a big thing, we focus around it, we build a small community around it. I would love for these communities to be laying the foundations for other communities to be doing their translations as well. And I think we can stop doing a lot of reduplicative work in these things if we sort of think about this. And I think it's also important to point out, like, the choice of texts we translate can help highlight certain non-English sources. So it's good to be thoughtful in doing this. So that's the sort of social aspect of the talk. As much as can be packaged into one part out of the way, I might drop a few sentences in the future. For now, I'm just going to talk about some of the previous projects I've done, 3 in particular. Here are some pictures of some things. My treat to myself is when I finish a nice translation, I print it out in a nice book and make it look pretty. That's my sort of like reward for finishing a thing. So I've done mostly French translations, mostly algebraic geometry and category theory, because this is what my PhD was in. I was in France doing algebraic geometry and category theory. So I've done some articles, letters, seminars, books, or whatever. Some of them are community translations, as we'll see. Some of them have been individual translations. Some of them have been working with the author. Some of them have very much not been. So I just wanted to talk about some of these. The main one, which I think is the most community-based one I've done, has been on Grothendieck and Dieudonné's EGA. So this is for people who are not algebraic geometers. This is sort of like the foundational work in algebraic geometry, in category theory, in sheaf theory, in parts of homological algebra, in many things. It laid a lot of groundwork. It was written all throughout the 1960s by Grothendieck and Dieudonné in a community with other people involved. They never finished it. The table of contents on Wikipedia is great to read. If you read the table of contents on Wikipedia of the planned thing, they published very little of what they set out to publish. In reality, they published nearly 2,000 pages, so it really shows you the scope of what they imagined. It's still the standard reference for many statements for the contemporary work in geometry. We have the Stacks project as a very useful thing, which which sort of like actually spells out in slightly more detail a lot of the contents of book 1 and a lot of book 2, actually all of book 0. But it's not uncommon to see citations to volumes 3 and 4. 3, by the way, of which you would think 1,800 pages is equally divided. It's not. Like, I think 900 pages is volume 3. This has been the bane of my translation time. Even modern sources still point to volumes 3 and 4 as sort of like the de facto places to look. This is my sort of like villain origin story, because when I was an undergraduate at university, in a university that had very little respect for student support and student time, I did an introductory course on scheme theory, the first course I ever did on scheme theory, and I was completely lost. We'd done one course on geometry before. I asked the lecturer what I could read, any other resources, and he said to me, yes, you should just read EGA. And I said, it's in French and it's long, and he was like, doesn't matter, it's easy, it's just French, right? Like the words are the same. If you just know like the 3 different geometry words, then you're fine. So sort of out of spite, I then spent the next 12 years trying to translate EGA. And I still haven't finished. I'm not even halfway through. But it started me off doing a lot of this stuff. So in a way, I'm thankful for it. So what's this actually look like as a translation project? It's mainly been joint with this guy, Ryan Coletti, who's a student in America. We have, as you can see here, this is a page of the GitHub repository for it. There are 9 contributors, which just means 9 people have changed even a single letter in the repository. There's about, I would say 6, but this count might be out of date. 6 of them have contributed like multiple sections, multiple chapters. It's mainly been myself and Ryan. I did essentially EGA 2, he did EGA 0, we both did EGA 1. We've only done about 500 pages so far, which is 25,000 lines of LaTeX. And as you can see, that's actually half was such an overstatement. We're like a quarter of the way through, essentially. Rather demotivating, but oh well. It's been quite popular in the sense that 300 people have started on GitHub. I actually get free Math Overflow bounty where I can put bounties on my questions on Math Overflow, because every couple of weeks I get an upvote for me linking this in an answer of somebody saying, hey, is there a translation of EGA? So it's been like a little revenue stream for me for Math Overflow bounty points, which is entirely useless, but nice. And one thing that I've been asked a lot is why bother doing this? Especially if you look at the comments to the Math Overflow question, which is there an English translation of EGA? The top 3 comments are, why? Mathematical French is easy, right? I don't even speak French, and I can read mathematical French. The only thing I feel comfortable saying on a recording now is like, that's not true for me. Like, if it's true for them, congratulations to them. I speak French, I find mathematical French quite hard, because I find mathematical English quite hard, and I speak English quite well. So I claim that actually it's a lot more subtle than what people might give it credit for. But again, I feel this is recognized within this audience. Yes?
Could you say a couple of words about the Stacks project?
Oh, sorry, yes. So the Stacks project, I mean, this is just maybe like, the Stacks project can be seen as a sort of like modern version of EGA. It's a fully online, free, sort of like textbook website thing, has a very large overlap with the contents of EGA, and is sort of being used over the last, I would say, 10 years. When theorems have been proved in both Stacks and EGA, people are starting to cite Stacks project more because it's modern and in English. So it's sort of like a modern replacement it doesn't frame itself as a modern replacement, but practically it's replacing some aspects of EGA. So this is one of the community projects. This is the longest term, largest community project I've worked on. As you can see, that's like 6 people, and really it's just me and one guy talking most of the time, so it's much smaller than what we have here. And this has never been in person, so it's been a very different experience. And I'm going to talk a little bit about like the sort of technology that supported this and how we've done these sort of remote translations together at some point. Why would I bother doing an English translation of this? I came up with a bunch of reasons, and actually I won't read through all of them. I will just put some of them up on the screen. Some of them are good, some of them are bad reasons. The one that I really want to point out, I think actually, the one that finally convinced me to do this was I had to read EGA anyway, and I was already writing notes down in my textbook, so I was like, oh, come on, everyone's probably doing this. Why don't we just... that, and the third one, which is that when you read a very long sentence, especially in algebraic geometry, which has like 36 adjectives modifying every single noun because you need to know if your scheme is, you know, a quasi-compact Noetherian, blah, 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 blah. French is better than English for this because French at least has agreement in gender and plurality, so you can sometimes tell where adjectives pair up with the nouns. You cannot do this in English. I actually claim that this is a frustration in English. I have a specific slide on it later. But my point is, the sentences are hard and need unpacking. Okay, they're very technical, lots of quantifiers, and in maths it makes a big difference if you mistranslate, if you just miss an S off the end of a letter to make sure it agrees with one noun or another noun. That makes a massive difference. Often it makes your maths wrong. Second translation I just wanted to highlight is Grothendieck's 1991 letter to Thomason on derivators, which was a letter I translated. It was the first and only letter I've ever done. Letters are really hard to translate, I will say. And the two things that really peaked to me are, what is this sort of thing of like slang is like, for want of a better word, but much more just like the kind of language you don't find in a published paper so much. So two things which I really struggled to translate are, I should have thought to put up the parallel thing in French here. I could have asked for some people in the audience for their opinions as well. But one sentence here, as you can see, I had to translate like, it made me gnash my teeth from start to finish, which I guess like you can say in English and it works. It's not what I would say, but it's a sort of literal translation and it sounds like something somebody from 1991 would say to me if they were born much earlier. So there's a question here. The one that was really difficult was...
I don't know the word gnash in English.
I don't know it in French either now. I'm sorry you've like put me on the spot.
Who can explain to me what gnash is?
Yeah.
Okay,
yeah. Sorry, yeah. And then the second one was a sentence which I spoke to 3 or 4 different French mathematicians to translate it in the end, and we came up with, you're very capable of finding where it screws up by yourself. So here he's talking about an error in another paper. And again, I've never said this sentence out loud as an English speaker, but I understand what it means for something to screw up, to go wrong. But there's a spectrum of ways you can translate this from where it goes wrong to something much more profane. And something that happens when you're translating a letter is, this is, as far as I know, the only English translation of this letter, and it's quite a widely known letter. If I put out an English translation where I translate this word by something incredibly explicit, I'm now imposing some sort of history on top of Grothendieck's style of writing and Grothendieck's personality, which is going to influence people's thoughts, and that's a large responsibility, right? I don't want to be claiming that he said something incredibly rude when he didn't, or he said something incredibly vulgar or violent. So it was quite hard to find a way to translate this so that you retain a similar level of contempt, which he had when speaking about this, in the cultural context of now, but so that it doesn't use maybe a more modern phrase which really puts it out of context. So these are the kind of questions which are very detail-oriented questions, and as I'm going to talk about later, I think like the general theory of translation has a lot to offer us on how to answer these sort of questions. One which I actually still have no clue about at all. So there's this entire letter, it's only, I think it's about 10 pages long. It's incredibly, it's written by Grothendieck. He's a very well-written, well-spoken person. He uses, technical language, but his French is not too floral and prosaic. It's like quite standard everyday French for 99% of it. But the final sentence is quite literally, it was, in which case, I will be very happy to have you as the interlocutor of my cogitations. I didn't know either of those words in English. I had to look them up. And it's very interesting to me. I still have no idea. This was literally the last sentence of the letter, so I just went with it. When you read the letter, it comes across as a real tonal shift. Like, these words are way out of context of the kind of words he's been using before. I have no idea if this was a sort of standard thing for people to say, whether this is some sort of like funny little ironic thing. I might sign off a message like this. I think it's like when you text a friend to meet up for coffee and then you say, best regards, yours truly, Tim, or whatever. I think that's funny. I don't know what the original intention was here. And this is a part where some sort of biographical sort of understanding of the person would be very helpful, and the sort of cultural context at the time. I have no idea. If someone would like to look at the original letter with me at some point, I would love to know what any native French speakers think about this.
Excuse me, I'm lost. This letter is written in which language?
Sorry, French. Everything I do is French,
So
generally.
Give us the French, the original.
I can, but not off
Where does
the...
the word interlocutor come from?
L'interlocuteur de mes cogitations.
Exactement.
Oh, we don't know. Okay.
Yeah, it's word for word, like...
The question is cogitation. What is the overtone? Yeah.
Yeah, sorry, yeah, this is, I said, I should have put the parallel translations up, but it's exactly the same. It's like they're words that exist in French and English, apparently. I knew them in neither language. This was the first and last letter I ever translated. At the moment, one that I'm working on, which is a different experience, most of the translations I've done are by, I've done a lot of Grothendieck ones, and sadly, obviously, Grothendieck is not here today. I've done some translation with Deline and spoken to Deline a little bit about some of the things, but I've never really had much input from an author. Recently, Andre Erisman asked me if I would translate 2 of Charles Erisman's papers on double categories. Double categories are having a sort of renaissance at the moment within category theory. People are getting really into them. They're cool. But some of the very original works on double categories, where Charles Erisman wrote about them as structured categories, structured in the category of functors, haven't been read because they're very long in French and use a very specific set of notations and definitions. Erisman loves to denote, for example, like a function even from x to y is a triple y, comma, f, comma, x. So composition goes backwards for him. It goes in what people sort of call like the categorical sense. And he writes functions as a triple, and the way he composes them is interesting. He does a lot of things which are like slightly confusing to read, even if you read this in English. I know what a double category is. I read his definition of a double category, and I had no idea how it was the same thing. So it's a very interesting paper. So Andre asked me if I would be interested in sort of translating this and a small companion paper that goes along with it. But what's been really exciting is not only can I talk to Andre about this, this paper was actually republished in, Andre edited together a collected works of Erisman, which includes an errata and includes addenda in English. So it has a bunch of corrections, and it also has a bunch of footnotes in English explaining things. And this has been invaluable because there is so much terminology within this paper which has never been translated because other approaches to double categories were picked up instead. So there is no English translation of them, so I would have to make one up. But Andre has already made them up for me, so now I can appeal to authority and use her translations instead, which is considerably better. Every now and then there are still some which, there's a few words where, and again, this is the thing of everything is a scanned PDF that doesn't support Control F, so it's quite hard to find these things. There are a few words where I've still had to kind of guess what the best one might be. For example, the word sommet comes up a lot, and whether that should be a vertex, whether that should be a point, whether that should, even within the context, it would make sense to translate it as object. This is a sort of taste thing, and I have to go, well, this is a very geometrically motivated thing. He talks about edges later on. I'm going to say that this thing is probably a vertex, but I don't know. But I can't find it anywhere in the errata or addenda, so I'm not sure that there is a sort of appeal to authorship there, authority there. But so this is the third one I just wanted to point out, which has been working in a very different thing, and an incredibly useful resource has been a collection of errata and addenda for me. And then one other project, I guess there's 2 other projects I just wanted to point out. One I'm going to skip over, but this one I just wanted to point out is this maths dictionary I started doing online. When I was translating a bunch of French stuff, I was like, wow, there are these words. I mean, I was learning mathematical French as I went along. This is the start of my PhD. So I was like, wow, I should just write down these words. And then I put them online, and I was like, oh, I know some of them in Spanish as well. I'll stick them up. And I had like, it's really not many. As you can see, it's about 300 words at the moment in this dictionary, or 300 sort of phrases, right? Like absolutely convergent series, that's one word to me. It's a word because, as I'll talk about later, there's this thing called Wikidata. So there's this sort of like unique key association for certain things. It's about 300 entries. I have had 50 people contribute. There's this cool little form you can fill out at the top. Anywhere that has like a missing word, you can just type it in and email, like you type it into the box and it emails me automatically. So I've had about 50 people in 16 different languages. Every language there that isn't English or French or Spanish was somebody else sent me a bunch of things, so I put it up there. The thing that's really interesting, which I mentioned earlier, is I was compiling this and then sort of out of nowhere, when this was very early on, I had an email, 2 emails separately from some people in Catalonia and some people in northern Spain sending me dictionaries in Catalan and Basque, which weren't just translating the sort of things like angle and line and function, but were translating things like even abelian category, things like left-derived functor, like quite technical mathematical language. So this was fantastic because it was a real indication that like, oh, there are people out there who are actively working towards these sort of things anyway. Can this be a nice place to bring together all of this stuff? At the moment, this is just one big file with like a nice web interface or whatever. As you can see, like, you know, gender is an important thing to put in any dictionary, but I'm going to talk about this later. This dictionary has a lot of shortcomings. It's something that I would very much like to work on to improve. But it's been a really nice community project to see so many people get interested by it. Like 50 people have never even read one of my maths papers. So it's like a very nice thing that 50 people at least have seen this. And then okay, I'll give a very short, here's a tiny video that I will play. At some point, it turns out if you take a maths dictionary and you plug it into some things in computer science called these parsers, you can build up a sort of like, essentially like automatic translator, which doesn't use any sort of statistical inference. It doesn't use anything at all. It translates things that it knows it can translate. It tells you what it can't translate, and it can tell you exactly what it can't translate by pointing to its specific number in a dictionary. So this was a thing that I built, and it was kind of cool, and I would love to revisit it one day. I don't really know a use case for it, but it's just a point of once you have these open source online resources like a big dictionary, people can just go away and build stuff on top of it. They can do cool stuff that you can't even imagine. Great. I'm going to talk a little bit now about some useful tools that I found. Maybe I'll pause and see actually if there are any questions from anybody about any of the previous stuff. Yes.
Okay, go ahead.
Yes.
All right. My question is, I have a little bit concern about the how to keep the information safe. Take for instance, when you are translating from one language to another from the text, how do you ensure there is no loss of information? That the information will still remain intact, the way it is, still remain as it is 100%.
That's hard. I mean, I think there isn't ever any guarantee of this, right? Like, I think this is something that is proved sort of like by time. I mean, generally, if I do a translation, I read through the text, I then read through again and translate as I go, maybe like leave some bits to come back to them or whatever. Then when I'm finished, I read through the English translation to check that it works in English. Then I read again the French translation and check that it's the same, like that I'm seeing the same things and I haven't missed anything. And then I'll go through and try to like pair it up again sentence by sentence and check that, you know, everything's correct and I haven't made any mistakes in the thing. But like, I still make mistakes and I still miss stuff. People still point things out in the future. I really think there isn't a good way of doing this beyond getting people to read it, to be honest with you, and like using it as a resource. I think something I will say is something I've never done and realized when I was writing these slides that I should definitely do is translations are, in my opinion, much better when they are parallel translations, in the sense of presenting the reader with the original and the translation at the same time. I think this doesn't solve this problem, but it really helps, because in doubt, there is always the original translation there. I think presenting translations as parallel is super, super user-friendly in some sense. So I think this kind of helps a little bit. Yeah, it's okay. Yes.
Yeah. Could you go back to the previous page? Because
this one.
Yes. Or the previous one. Okay. So there is an assumption, it seems to me, when you are doing this way.
Yes.
And the assumption is that the term will not change.
This is great.
You have no time dimension.
Yes, fantastic.
But
That's not true.
we are here to tell you that
I'm very aware of this, yes. And there's,
two suggestions.
yes, please.
I think that each translation should be attached to a sentence and a source that would attach the
Perfect, thanks.
the translation of the term to a real thing in time.
I think this is, you've predicted my very last slide in the talk, so that's fantastic, thank you.
The other thing is, you have 19th century dictionaries
Yes.
of mathematical
Yes.
terms that you could.
That's another, thank you, this is perfect. No, I'm very happy to hear that because it means that my talk is at least on topic. Yes, these are two things that I'm going to talk about. This is fantastic. I want to talk about ways that this could be improved and resources like this. And you've picked two very key things. Yes, thank you. Yes.
Yes, I have a very small remark which is a follow-up to what Karin just said. And you mentioned, among the details you mentioned with the Eresman translation, you mentioned the problem of the word sommet.
Yes.
And I find this very interesting because sommet is the term for vertex used by Poincaré and these pioneers of topology, of course. And Eresman, in the beginning of his career, he was a topologist, I don't know.
Topologist, yeah.
Yeah, and the interesting question is why he chose this term, to stick with this term in a new context.
Exactly. That's also something I'm going to talk about later. This is fantastic. Yeah, but it's really interesting. This is my key point of how so in some sense, I have, I can hear the voices in my head that are like, does it really matter? Pick a word, translate it, it's maths. As long as you use the same word throughout, it doesn't matter. But no, I don't actually believe that. So I think these sort of questions really point out that you even just I've been given the ideal scenario, right, where it's translate this paper on a really popular topic where you have English errata and addenda, and you can talk to André Eresman, who was the co-author on a lot of these papers, to ask questions in English. Even here, you hit questions of what was Charles's original training in? You have historical aspects that hit you, even in these sort of ideal translation scenarios, which means that when you're working in much less ideal scenarios, the idea of having translation as this sort of machine where you turn a crank and it works because it's mathematics and mathematics is easy just isn't believable to me. I think this really highlights these points. And also, I get no small joy. I'm not a historian of mathematics, but I think it's really cool. And I get no small joy in noticing these sort of trails of how the terminology is influenced and how the thoughts are influenced by such things. So yes, good point. Thank you. Okay, let me move on to some useful tools. So I'm just going to point out some things that have been useful for me in doing translations. Some of these are not applicable to the letter, the Brill-Murtha letter. Some of them are generally very obvious, but it's just I wanted to have these things as a sort of thing for anyone who wants to get interested in translation, who might be watching this afterwards maybe, sort of things that end up being useful. A very obvious one is contemporaneous work. So something you find a lot is authors who publish, for example, in French, likely also publish in English. They likely talk about some similar things. So if you're struggling with certain terminology or certain phrases or even certain statements that you can't quite clarify mathematically what they mean, a great place to look is other texts by the same author. Sometimes even other texts published in the same volume. It's much more common, I think, I could be wrong here. My understanding is in the 60s and 70s, it was much more common for papers published in a journal to actually be a bit thematically closer. It's quite common you read a paper by, Burrell and, my mind's gone blank, paper, which literally says in the previous paper by Grothendieck, and they don't mean Grothendieck's last paper, they mean the previous one in the journal, in that volume of the journal. There's a lot more sort of chatter amongst them. So looking at the places these things were contextualized is super helpful. Reprints and collected works are often very good, but also can introduce new errors, new typos, new mistranslations, especially if it's sort of typed versions of handwritten things. Commentaries, reviews, and summaries. Anyone modern day talking about the work often has a need to translate it. Sometimes they don't. They just put it in italics and little scare quotes. Textbooks has been a really useful one in terms of if you're translating something on mathematical subject X and you can find a textbook in source language on X, likely you might find some overlap. Texts that cite it is another good one. I go onto Google Scholar, find everyone that cites it and see if any of them make an effort of translating some of the terminology. And then when they all inevitably disagree, I ignore them all and just pick a new one, which I think is better. And then lastly, Math Overflow, or even Wikipedia, if you can find people talking about it on there. This has also been a good source for me sometimes. Wikipedia and Wikidata in general, so this is 2 screenshots of Wikidata for the entry of an algebra over a field. So it's, I don't know, in some sense I think this is a flawed project, but I think it's a very, very good flawed project. All projects are flawed. I think this one is useful. So there's this thing called Wikidata where they just try to put like every concept that exists, let's write it down and give it a number. Great, perfect. You run into some like very obvious issues very quickly, but they're still doing it, right? And it's useful, even if it's not flawed. So here's the Wikidata entry for algebra over a field. And as you can see, this has some descriptions. It has like language. So on the left is just the Wikidata page for it. So it has like, in 4 languages, they've given it a label, which is like, what is the name of this entity? They've given it a short description, but not in French or Spanish. They don't get to know what it is. And then they've given some synonyms for it, okay? So this is just sort of like people hand typing stuff. There's no structure to this. There's no citations. There's no nothing. There's just people saying stuff, right? So this is a little bit useful. But it turns out if you scroll down the Wikidata page, it links to every Wikipedia article which cites this concept as the concept that that page is about. This has been super useful. Wikipedia has been the single best mathematical dictionary I've used for this kind of stuff. It is fantastic when it is fantastic. When it doesn't work, it's terrible. But like generally, it's very good. One thing which is an immediately obvious thing though, or maybe immediately obvious, is all of these things are not translations of one another. For example, I don't speak Dutch, but I'm pretty sure that in the NL wiki, like parentheses are not a direct translation of the English word algebra. The translation does not have parentheses in it. And the same for CS and for CV. I don't believe these parentheses are part of it. And I can guess that maybe structure means structure. So I'm guessing this means it's a disambiguation page. And I can also tell that if you look at EO, it's just algebro, and in English it's algebra over a field. I don't believe that EO as a language is concise enough that it can skip those last 3 words and have no ambiguity introduced. So it's a very useful resource, but it's not one that we can just sort of like machine pull from and be like, done, we've built a big dictionary, it's great. Because these things are all contextualized within their language. And then when you move to like other alphabets, for example, with Farsi, I might have absolutely no idea whether that says, I mean, like, guess it says something like algebra over a field because it's pretty long. But I don't know, maybe in Farsi the word for algebra is just quite long. There is absolutely no way for me as a non-language speaker to know this. So it's a great tool, but it's not something that is like perfectly formatted for just immediate use. It needs human thought still put into it. But it is a very, very good tool. Yes?
It so happens that I'm working on Chinese, and I don't understand why there are 2 entries for Chinese, but the first one is completely misleading because it simply says algebra.
Okay.
So I don't know why there are parentheses, because what is in
Algebra? Algebra. Yeah, it's exactly the same as the thing before it.
And there is no disambiguation, it's
No.
just algebra.
Exactly. Yes, that's true. This is, you know, the Wikipedia page is just written by someone. This is not being carefully written as a Wikipedia page. So again, like, it definitely needs caution when using it. The nice thing is, theoretically, anyone, if you see a problem, you can just go and fix it. The hard thing is, like, actually that involves some technical, you know, it's not just a trivial thing. I noticed some issues. I'm going to point one out later. But I just want to say, this is a super useful resource, though, that I found very useful and could definitely be improved. But I'm not going to complain first. I'm going to praise it first because it's been great. Something else that generally is, I picked up this book recently in a charity shop, Thinking Spanish Translation, which is just generally, it turns out that, like, you know, if you try to not have the maybe typical mathematician mindset, which I don't think is typical of people in this room, but maybe of like sort of like, you know, there's mathematics and then there's everything else. Turns out translation is really hard and people study it all the time anyway as an entire field of study. And learning some things about that is pretty helpful. This book was great for me. It has a good chapter on scientific translation in particular. And it talks about, again, this is one of my citations for why scientific translation is hard, is if you read through, it talks about some interesting points. I could go into them, but I'm going to save that for if there's time at the end. One thing that I do want to point out, that this is actually really changed the way I do translation, though, is the importance of pre-translation work, which is this thing of the way I approached my translations originally was you're doing it sentence by sentence. Maybe you've read the whole thing first and you've got an idea, but then you sort of go sentence by sentence, and you keep on hitting these sort of like questions of detail very soon, very early on. You're 3 sentences in, and already you have to decide how to translate one specific word, and you have a choice of how to translate it. So you make that choice using some reasons, and then you carry on, and you hit another word you have to translate. So you have to think about that, and you have to make that choice using some other reasons that you think about. And the point is, once you've done like 10 choices, you've probably considered similar reasons many times. So it's really worth sitting down beforehand, which is what I'm starting to try to do now, and sort of answer the high-level questions to which you will refer to answer these low-level questions later on. So some of them are the very obvious ones, like, who wrote this? Who is the intended audience? What is the purpose of my translation? Who is my intended audience? Am I going to provide this as a commentary? Am I going to provide footnotes? Am I going to provide an errata at the end? Do I want to break up the flow of the text, or do I want to intersperse things in between? Is it going to be a parallel translation? Sitting down and sort of agreeing upon all of these things beforehand, for me at least, for the last translation I've done like this, does mean that a lot of the times there's still work to be done in answering those detailed questions, but my first step now when answering those detailed questions is I look back at the thing I wrote first of all and go, oh, I should make this choice, because at the beginning I said this was going to be the case. I said I was only going to footnote things if they were of a certain type, and everything else I'm going to leave to put an addenda in the end. This sort of like pre-work before diving in, something that I'm not very good at, but I'm learning is incredibly useful. So just generally though, the entire idea of like translation methodology as taught in a translation course has been very helpful, to no surprise. So let me just talk very quickly about this sort of like technological aspect of some of these open source translations I've been doing. I guess now I should like say the talk's called Open Translations. Open is playing like 3 or 4 different roles in that sentence. One thing it means is open source, by which I mean anyone can contribute and make corrections, blah, 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 blah. This is what this is going to talk about. Another thing I mean by open is just sort of like the vibe of like, it's sort of like, it's there, people can have it, people can use it, people can't. And it's sort of like an open community thing. Open is a very overloaded word. It's great. I love it. So I put all of my translations up on GitHub, which means anyone can view the source code of them, the tech, or the markdown. I'll talk about that in a sec. But it also, by putting them up on GitHub, I get 3 very useful things that happen to me immediately. First of all, on the far left here, you can see I get issues. So what does this mean? For those who don't know, so GitHub is this website. You can create a little sort of like repository on it. It's a page. It's a home page for your code normally, but your code can be LaTeX code. And one thing it gives you is it gives you a little subpage called issues, where anyone can come along and go, I found a mistake, here it is, please fix it. And then you go yes or no, and then you click accept, and then you make that change. So this is the thing on the left. You can see on the EGA translation, some people have pointed out that, that in EGA 1.7.4.3, there's a mistake. This is actually a very interesting one, because they've pointed out there's a mathematical mistake. And that's why I haven't actually solved this issue, because I don't know what to do, because the translation is correct, but the statement is wrong. So now I'm not too sure how I should proceed with this one. You can see there's also people telling me that my like numbering of subletters is wrong, and the kerning for the prime notation is wrong, and things like this. I also get a page on a thing called pull requests, which are anybody can come along and go, oh, I want to do some of this translation. Here's a chunk. I'm going to do this chunk. I'm going to do... Tim Hosgood recently said he was going to do EGA 3 section 2, and he said that in 2022. And as you can see, has done 4 things in the last 3 years, so he's not doing very well on it. But they can just come along, they do these things, there's a comment thread, people can comment and suggest and whatever. This has been super useful as well. And then when it's done at the end, you click merge, and it sticks it in, and now your big translation has it. And the other nice thing is, all of these stuff are built live, by which I mean these first 2 things happen. Someone spots an issue and they fix it, or someone adds some new content and they fix it. A little computer somewhere up in the cloud, where all computers live now, goes along and it builds my LaTeX PDF, and it builds an HTML version of it, and it puts it on my website, and I don't have to do anything. It's just there. It's live updated. I've never had to like click build on a LaTeX thing and watch a LaTeX error happen in front of me. So this is really nice. There's like a lot of technological streamlining that can happen. But the technological bar to entry is very high. These things are not easy to use in general, okay? I'm a nerd. That's why I know about all of this stuff, but they're not super user-friendly, okay? So this is something I want to talk about a little bit later. Something I will just say briefly as well is a personal thing that I've noticed is as a mathematician, I'm used to writing in LaTeX. I write everything in LaTeX all of the time. That's been pretty great. LaTeX makes great PDFs. Something I've noticed is PDFs are really terrible for a lot of accessibility issues. They're very bad for screen readers. They're also sometimes really annoying of like sometimes a web, like Wikipedia is easier to click around in than a like 1,000 page PDF of a textbook, right? Web browsers are built for going back, going forwards, going things, and you can get nice PDF readers, I know this or whatever, but a web interface is nice. So actually now, nearly all of my translations, unless I know they are specifically PDF only for print, I actually write them in this language called R Markdown, which, as you can see, is basically LaTeX. I mean, all of the maths is LaTeX, it's just the sort of like begin and end environments are different. There's these 3 colons instead. And at the top, you can see how you sort of put information like the title and the author and loads of other stuff. It's not incredibly different from LaTeX, but it is a different language. It's not like completely trivial. But what's nice is when I write my stuff in R Markdown, I can build PDFs and web versions immediately for free. It just does both of them at the same time. And I can go in and style my LaTeX and make my LaTeX look nice, but I also get a much more accessible, much more browsable web version. Here, for example, you can see on the table of contents there's only 3 chapters, but when, for example, this is like FGA, another Grothendieck book, like series of seminars on geometry, the table of contents is, 6 volumes. In each volume there's 20 chapters. In each chapter there's 58 subsections or whatever. It's a lot easier to navigate around this in your browser and bookmark things and share a link to a specific section that you can just copy and paste to someone than it is to use a PDF. Yes?
Is it freely accessible?
Yes, everything here is open source sort of software. And I'm happy to talk at some point about the sort of like technology that goes into this for sure. But I just want to skip over that. I noticed, sorry, I said I would only be an hour and then here's a fantastic book that I wish there existed more of. So maybe people are familiar with this book. It's a book called Russian for the Mathematician. And it is a course, it's a chunky book. It's about 300 pages. And it's exactly what it says. It's a very specific book. It's to learn Russian as a working mathematician. And it's 20 pages of the alphabet, 10 pages of pronunciation, 30 or 40 pages on grammar, and then 200 pages essentially on like real excerpts and exercises to do with them, and then like vocab lists built and whatever. And the forward starts with this fantastic thing of like the Board of the Trustees of the American Mathematical Society expressing its belief that a great deal of time would be saved for mathematicians if they could study a textbook of Russian precisely adapted to their needs, granted to the present author 9-month leaves of absence from his duties as editor of translations. So if someone can write this book in 9 months, it's not that easy to write a book in 9 months, but if someone could write this book in 9 months, wouldn't it be great if we could find some way for some people to write other books like this? I would love a French for the Mathematicians book. That would have been incredibly useful when I wanted to get into algebraic geometry. And I would love other books for other languages as well. It's super niche, super specific, but it lays a really great template for what it might look like to have a course or a book or a resource specifically built around language X for the mathematician. It's a non-trivial thing to write, but it is incredibly specific, but incredibly high value for those that get value from it. So it's a really cool book. Just entirely useless to me because I've never needed to read a Russian paper. But if I did, it would be great. I would love a German for the mathematician one, because in my field, everything's in German. So I would love a German for the mathematician book. So let me just talk a little bit briefly about some difficulties I've come across. Here I'll whiz through, hopefully. Sorry, I do ramble. I'll try to whiz through because you've seen a lot of difficulties in translation. You don't need pointing out many of these. One is sort of technical terminology. As we know, this is sort of like the obvious one, right? Like, sometimes a native speaker could suffice, but sometimes you need them to be a mathematician, sometimes they need to be in your domain, and sometimes they need to be a specific period of time. I'm interested here, because I know there are French speakers here. I saw the word trace used for intersection of sets, okay? And I asked my colleague at the time, who was a PhD student in France, a French PhD student around my age, what the word trace meant here in this sentence. And it wasn't used as an intersection of sets, it was used as an intersection of like derived schemes or something like this. And he was like, I don't know how you take the trace of a derived scheme. That's really weird. That doesn't quite type check to me. And then we looked around and everywhere, like it just came up with trace. Now that I know that trace means intersection in this sort of period of time, it's not the most common word for it. Last night, when writing this slide, I was like, I need to feel vindicated here. I need to know that I couldn't have just solved this by going on Wikipedia at the time. And if you go on the Wikipedia page for intersection in French, it doesn't say the word trace anywhere. If you go on the one for set theory, it doesn't say it. If you go on the one for union, it doesn't say it anywhere. However, there is a specific page called trace, disambiguation, set theory, intersection, which doesn't link to the page on intersections. And it really frustrated me, and I should have fixed it, but I didn't. I'm just going to complain about it instead. But it's like just this one specific word that caused me so much issue that was so hard to track down until I found someone who knew exactly what it meant, and then it was so easy to track it down, right? And it doesn't help that trace is such a common word. This is a big issue with French, is words can be very similar to what they might be in English, which means you get a lot of search results for them, and it's quite hard to find them in a specific context. Another one that I really struggled with here, I highlighted it in yellow. This is from FGA, I think FGA 4. There's a part here where they write, supposons de plus que les hommes blancs soient bijectifs. So easy to translate, okay? It just says like, suppose furthermore that for all SNS, the blah, whatever they are, that's some maths, are bijective, okay? Great. Here's the issue though, is homme is not a function, it's a set, it's a space. It doesn't make sense for a set to be bijective. Okay? That's a very confusing thing to write. And a capital H om is always used to denote the set of homomorphisms. So I read through, I think about this, I ask some people online, we sit down and we like try to figure out what they're saying. And it turns out that here hom shouldn't be capitalized and it should just be short for homomorphism. It should just be short for homomorphisms. It's just like a short typo that was maybe used when it was written by hand and it was typed up incorrectly as hom like this. And this caused me no end of frustration. I finished the entire translation apart from this one sentence. And I could have just skipped over it, but I couldn't let it rest. And it took me like 2 weeks to solve this like tiny thing. Partially because, this isn't my full-time job. I claim I could have solved it in 1 week if I'd had more time. But there are these things which are just like small typos, small mistakes, or even just slightly sloppy notation can really trip you up, irrelevant of the language, right? This happens even in English things. And this can be super frustrating when you're doing translations. It can be very hard. Because in some sense, the purpose of translation rate is to remain faithful to the author. But as mathematicians, we want our translations to remain faithful to mathematics somehow. And there's this constant tension between the two. This is fantastic audience for this, actually. So I'm trying to do a German translation at the moment, which is great, because I don't speak German. So it's going very slowly. Here's a paper I have to read for my research. And I spoke to a German algebraic geometer about this, but of a very special flavor of algebraic geometry, right? And we agreed that there are some words here, like Schnittring is intersection rings, right? And Zahlenraum is number spaces. Great. I don't know what those words mean, but I know this subject. So those words that can't be the right translation in some sense, because I don't know what those words mean. And I should when this sentence is translated, because I understand the rest of it. So here there's an issue of like, even with a native speaker, their domain knowledge is not specific enough to help me in a certain case. And it could be the case, I sound confident, it could be the case that maybe the correct translation actually is intersection rings. And this is just introducing a definition that I've never heard of before. This is a really interesting one. This is really frustrating me. If anyone wants to have another German translation to work on at some point, please.
Very unusual German. Grundtheorie, Hallenringe. I mean,
Great, I'm happy to hear that at least I'm having troubles for it.
Is this Austrian or I don't know.
Okay.
This is Swiss because
Swiss.
from
Oh, it's Swiss German.
It's Swiss's fault, of course. Okay, great, fantastic. Okay, that's good to know. So these are things that would help me. Okay, fantastic. But either way, yeah. So this is just another example of, even in a language like German, which tricks you into thinking that translation will be easy because words are made up of little words, that's not how it works. It becomes very frustrating. An interesting one is anachronistic translation, which is sort of like how you translate terminology that changes over time. So some things you might see when you read original papers on sources are they use terminology like good. Good is the bane. I don't know if anyone here does any sort of like algebraic topology, but we talk about good covers quite a lot. And that is like the worst terminology you could have because good is just not a searchable word, it's not a useful word, it's not descriptive at all. But in the original paper on it, they were like, yeah, this cover's pretty good. Fine, okay? But that terminology has now been specified in later cases, depending on what context that's in. We use a different word rather than good. We now use things like C good or B good instead. Sometimes they say things like, oh, something's satisfying axiom B. This might later on be given a name. So when you translate it, what do? And another thing is like, you'll see a lot of things that will be like, oh, this construction of Grothendieck, blah, 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 blah. Now that often has a name. Generally, it's now just called the Grothendieck construction, which is like slightly different, but still, certain things are named after people, and then they're not named after people, then they are named after people. So how do we deal with these? Do we translate them literally as a historical text, or we translate them so that modern readers will actually know what it means? And one answer might just be like, just put footnotes in explaining everything. If you try to read a text with a lot of footnotes, that breaks up, I claim that it's not just an easy yes or no answer, right? Like, as you know, there's nuance in these things. This is like further compounded by like different choices made at different times in different groups. Even now, today, like as of 2025, in double category theory, there's two types of arrow, map, morphism. Even there, like there's a lot of confusion. Some people call one vertical and one horizontal. Some people call the other one, which goes down the page, the horizontal arrow, and the other one vertical. Some people call them taut and loose. Some people call them tight and loose. Some people call them arrows and pro-arrows. I call them weft and warp because I think that's a much cuter terminology. And I just want more chaos in the world. But like, there's all of these choices to go along with. So how do you imagine somebody trying to translate this in the future? And this is not specific to now. This happened in the past as well, right? I'm just pointing out like a thing that we're dealing with now. All of these exist, and all of these come from different people. You'll find that you can pretty much guess quite accurately whether someone is from Australia, France, America, or somewhere else in Europe, depending on which one of these they use. Okay, so it's like very specific to a time and place, but it causes a lot of confusion. A big one, which I also only learned recently, is French. Again, such a delightful language. I love it so much. Where you have the phrase a sigma algebra, right? Which means sigma algebra. This is where the people of Math Overflow are right. You don't need to know French to read this. If you know English, you read it. Yet, I've seen sources also call this thing a tribu. Has anyone seen, is this like a common terminology you guys have heard before for sigma algebra?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, even as undergraduates. Okay, fantastic. Not a single other page on Wikipedia, in any language on Wikipedia, has a second word for sigma algebra that I can find. French is the only language that does this. And it's great, because how do you translate tribu? Do you translate it to sigma algebra? Maybe there's some sort of difference between the two, which is more like I'm saying this as a translator who doesn't know, like, maybe there's some difference between the two. Maybe one has an implication that you're going to use it in a certain way. Like, there are lots of mathematical synonyms, but which have different vibes. Some people say pre-sheaf, some people say contravariant functor intercept. They're mathematically equivalent, but they imply different use cases. Maybe there's a distinction here, maybe it's just French just wanting to have a special word for everything, and it's really hard to tell in this case which one it is. And this is where the sort of pre-work can be helpful, because it's why did the author make the choice they made, okay? This one I'll go over very quickly, but like, English is a really bad language for some things, and here it would have been much more helpful if I'd have given more examples. I'm only going to give one at the bottom. But I promise you, it has happened, especially reading French stuff, where I want to translate the French as close as possible in the same number of words, but French has this lovely thing, like many good languages, where there is an accord in number and gender and possession between adjectives, nouns, and verbs. You can tell what goes with where. They conjugate verbs in French. It's crazy. They do all of this stuff, which we just don't do in English essentially at all. And it means that you can write something very concise in French, which is not ambiguous at all, because you know this adjective points to this noun, whereas this adjective modifies the whole phrase. You know, sometimes there's this question of where do you put your brackets around things? And in English, you just can't do this. So to write it clearly in English, you often have to rephrase the entire sentence or make it just much more heavyweight. A big discussion we had early on in the EGA translation was how we should use the subjunctive in English. So I'm very much not a prescriptivist when it comes to grammar, but I understand that sometimes certain constructions are useful. The subjunctive in English is useful when you do certain things. And this is a case where me and some of the other contributors had a big discussion about how to best translate like something, it is necessary and sufficient. So almost all of these possible ones were done. I cut 3, choose 3. So like almost all 6 of these were like someone had picked one of more than 6. 9. Wait, how? I can't do combinatorics. Almost all of these combinations appeared, right? Where people would say, in order for X to satisfy Y, it's necessary and sufficient for. The most common one which people were using, which I didn't like, this was an entirely me thing, people would say, for X to satisfy Y, it's necessary and sufficient for Z to satisfy W. I don't really like that as a sentence. I find that quite confusing, because I can parse it as like, for X to satisfy Y, it is necessary, and it's sufficient for Z to satisfy W. Like, there's confusion here. I really like here, for me, the good one, which I tend to use, is like, in order for x to satisfy y, it's necessarily sufficient that z satisfy w. This is the subjunctive in English. Not that z satisfies w, that z satisfy w. But the problem is it sounds kind of pompous. Yes?
You confront difficulty by considering a comma at the first y, for instance.
Oh, yeah, I would definitely have a comma here. But yeah, I didn't want to get into the comma debate as well. That's like a whole extra thing on top of this. And like to me, the worst one which I saw somebody use was, it is necessary and sufficient for z to satisfy w for x to satisfy y. And like, it works, and it is a fair translation. And in some senses, this would actually be perfectly non-ambiguous, depending on what z, w, x, and y were, right? You can imagine that this might be true. But I personally really like the formulaic approach of whenever I see one of these, I'm always like, in order for x to satisfy y, it's sufficient that z satisfy w. That's why I put it at the top, because it's my favorite one, okay? So here I think the subjunctive is really useful. But it's not what all of my other contributors, native English speakers, use when translating into English, because that's not normal sounding in English. It does sound quite academic, quite fancy. I only learned that the subjunctive exists in English 6 years ago, it's not something we're taught, it's really not a thing. So it's a question of how do you deal with this tension of sort of how English is spoken and being precise. So this has been one that's really been interesting for me. I tend to translate quite stiffly and have sort of not the most flowing sounding language. And then my excuse is I translated from French, or I translated from German, so that's fine. That's it's not an English thing, so it's perfectly fine. But it is interesting to think about, because it can make it slightly harder for a reader to read. But it's something that non-native English speakers might not know is harder for an English person to read. And some English speakers might not find it harder to read, depending on where they went to school, because England is built on a bizarre class system where the entire way you speak your language talks about where you went to school. So it's a very, a lot of cultural things come into this. Editorial consistency is a big one, especially if you have 6 different contributors. How do you get it so that what's written sounds like it was written by a single author? The bonus question is, do you actually even want that in the first place? Okay? Then style guides help. So these things where you say oh, we use the subjunctive in this case, we use commas here, blah, 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 blah. But they're very hard to write, because you will find that when you write something, you think it's super clear to you, and then someone will be like, oh, but wait, I interpreted this other way in this other case, and then you're like, ah. And it's even harder to write them so that they're useful. If they're too long, no one's going to read them. And they don't solve all the problems. Even if you ask a bunch of people speaking one language to write a bunch of papers in one language and give them an editorial brief, they won't write everything in the same tone, because they're different people. So how do you deal with this, if you even want to deal with it at all? And then another question I've come across is sort of, how much effort should you ask of contributors? So you want to balance making things accessible, and so I'll answer this last question first. What counts as a contribution? So when people contribute to the translations that I host online, I keep a list of, these people have contributed to the translation. It says that right at the top of the PDF or the website or whatever. What counts as a contribution? I've set the bar at 0, where if you change a single letter and put a full stop in there, that's great. Your name goes on the thing. Perfect. I don't care. I've decided that for me, that's the level of entry I would like to have. However, it means I've run into some issues where I have people saying oh, look, I put this whole chapter of EGA, 38 pages into Google Translate, here it is, done. I've ticked it off the list. And I'm like, no, this would take me longer to fix than it would for me to translate this from scratch myself. This is actually a negative time that you've given me here by doing this thing. So there's this really difficult choice of balancing sort of making sure that contributions are good enough to be useful, but not doing unnecessary gatekeeping to make it so that it's a weird little selective club to get into. And it's a very hard cultural issue, community issue here that's nothing at all to do with sort of translation that's interesting to think about. Okay, I'm going to zoom through these. Sorry. Future resources. So these are things I would like to see in the future happen. And these are some things that I think it would be cool to find some sort of community desire to build. So first of all is my maths dictionary that I started. I would like it to actually be good. So one thing of what it means to be good is a dictionary should be good. My claim is a multilingual dictionary is good if it's good as a monolingual dictionary. By which I mean, if I come along reading it just in French, it should be useful to me as a French dictionary, okay? So something of what this means, and here I mean it as well, it should be useful as a French dictionary, even if I'm not French. So what this means for me is if something has an irregular plural, if I'm in a language where things have cases and a noun changes the way it's spelled in a case in a very irregular way, or other. I don't speak that many languages. I don't know what quirks languages have, right? All of these things should be built into that aspect of that language of the dictionary. The dictionary should be good by the standards of the language in which it's translating, okay? So this is something that needs a lot of work for sure. It would be cool to have a bunch of common phrases. I claim that if you just have a few key phrases, suddenly unlocking mathematical text becomes a lot easier. Writing mathematical text in a foreign language becomes a lot easier. Something that's sort of like a dive you in at the deep end if you do a PhD in France is they insist that you have to write a certain amount of your thesis in French. They insist that you teach in French. They insist that you do a lot in French. I think that's good. I'm not complaining about that. But it would be nice if there were some resources to help you start off on that, right? I'll talk about this a tiny bit more. And to bring back to your point, everything should have citations that are not just, here's a Wikidata entry about the abstract word. It should be, oh look, I got this word. Here's a place where you can find that word in the wild, in nature. For some words, this is going to be a little bit silly, maybe. For example, for the word set, right? You're not going to give every citation that includes the word set. That's silly. So you're obviously just going to make one or two key choices, like you would if you were writing a good monolingual dictionary. And then for other more highly technical words, it might be the case that there is exactly one paper in which they appear. So this is perfect. It'd be much better if it was like good software, so people could like comment on things, correct things. If you could like, right-click and download. I just want all of the French-English translations for algebraic geometry. Give me that as a PDF. That would be cool. And I would love for it to be much more sort of open by design in the sense of like, when you do all of these translations, like how do we make sure that like anyone can just take it, they can add to it, they can spin off their own version, all this open source stuff. Some software that's very useful, almost, but not quite for our specific use case, is there's this thing called WebLate, which is what software developers use to translate their software. So for example, if you use your web browser and you change the language in your web browser, someone has done that translation for you. But when you're doing stuff like web browsers translation or translating any piece of software, you actually have some of the same things that you'll find when you translate mathematics. On the left here, you can see this is a translation. At the top it says custom search counts words. What this means is this is a translation for the English phrase something word, where the something is going to be a number, okay? So we know that in English, how you translate the word word depends on what that number is. If it's one or if it's more than one, we're going to have to pluralize it or not. If this were Arabic, you'd have another one for dual. If there's two, you need a special thing. And you can see here in Czech, for example, there's 3 pluralization cases. There's one, few, and other, which I think is beautifully descriptive. I really love that. But there's this whole piece of sort of like web interface built around doing these translations in contexts where you know how the words are going to be used. Like you know certain nouns will be modified by certain adjectives or whatever. So I did try sort of like spinning this off to use something similar for doing contributions to the dictionary, but it turned out to be incredibly hard. But it would be great. My point is, good software exists for similar fields, just not for mathematics. I would love, as I said before, the Russian for mathematics. It'd be great if we could like have more of these books for others, because they are highly specific. When you read this, you can't say like, I went to the cinema last week with my friends. That's the first thing you learn when you do a language course normally somewhere else. But I do want to be able to say that I can take a left-Kahn extension along an acyclic cofibration of delta lenses. That's a useful sentence to me. I don't want to go to the cinema last weekend with my friends in my maths papers. I want to do the other thing. So having like a highly specific resource that doesn't spend time doing things I'm not going to need would be really useful. It can start with some nice little building block phrases, give you the general vocabulary, building off the framework of how the Russian for the mathematician works, give you examples from actual papers. It would even be interesting to see what a long-term course based on this looked like at a university. I was very lucky that I got away with doing a translation and commentary as one of my master's thesis in the history of mathematics department. So I got to translate this paper that was only in French, and a very recent paper, it was like 2000 and something, and this was in 2016, so it was very recent at the time. It was in French, not available in English, and it was like cutting edge research. It was a super exciting project, and I'm not special. There are lots of undergraduates who would find that a super interesting project. It would be really cool if we could find ways to get these sort of translation projects baked into a curriculum and actually give undergraduates and like early career researchers sort of like academic recognition for doing this sort of important work. Something else I would love to see again, emphasizing this idea of like, I just want there to be more stuff to translate, not less of it, is I think it would be really nice to have sort of a place, a little online community where people are writing stuff in maths in not English. Because this is very useful if you want to learn the language, and it's very useful if you want to translate from the language, and it's very useful if you want to translate to the language. So it'd be very cool to sort of build this community of like, you know, it's some like multilingual blog and it publishes these sort of like what if AMS style things. This is me like pipe dreaming now, you know, these are my like big vision things. I think this would be super cool. I would love to read this. I think it would be great if I could see an article in a language I don't really read and have it there in the context of all of these other articles in different languages. And I go, I actually want to sort of unpack this. This is now a really useful tool for me to get, like, I want to learn German for this paper. Here's a great expository article. I kind of want to learn about something and it'll help me unpack the German at the same time. I think something else this would do is sort of like language-specific references are, for me, have been kind of a bane as a researcher of mathematician. Like I said, I do a lot of work in complex geometry, and a lot of the work on the type of complex geometry I do was written in the 60s and 70s in German. And I know that there's loads of great work there. I only know that it's there because I happened to be lucky enough to speak to someone who pointed me in the right direction of it. But because it's in German, it doesn't really get cited in the English work, in the English literature very often. So it's very hard for me to know like what there even is that I don't know within this domain of research. And there are some of these sort of like obvious ones, like there's loads of German complex geometry, there's loads of category theory in French, there's loads of old geometry in Italian. We know these, even though, like I said, we don't know exactly what's there if we don't speak the language, but there are other key parts missing. The one that like I just want to know is like, what mathematics is happening such that people are collating dictionaries of abelian categories in Basque? What research is happening there that I don't know about, even though I care about abelian categories? And this is something that I think, I don't know, this to me, this intrigues me so much. Like, what is happening in all of these other languages? It's very much the case that, you know, I don't know numbers. If I were well prepared, I would have found some numbers, but like 99% of maths papers are published in English. The other 50% are published in French, and then like 10% in the past are in German, and then there's some Italian. And like, you know, after this, the numbers decrease very rapidly, but that doesn't mean there's nothing there. And I still think it'd be really interesting to see what's happening. Something I would like to do is all this GitHub technological stuff I talked about. I'd like to reduce the barrier to entry to make that easy for people to use. You click a button and bam, you've got a little thing there, everything's set up for you. That would be nice. And this, I want to say like this workshop I was so excited to get an invite. I don't speak German, I've never read a letter by Brill and Noether, I don't really know that much about this type of geometry, but I was like, whoa, there's people doing translation stuff? That's fantastic. And the very act of like translation and also sort of like contemporary commentary on the thing you're translating is so core in other domains. You speak to humanities students, this is like the bread and butter of what they do quite often. But, as I'm sure many of you are aware, in mathematics, this is not seen as sort of like, as valuable as research. This is a very different skill set. It's a niche little thing sometimes. And how do you make this seem more valuable? How do you create this sort of legitimacy and prestige around it? I don't know. If I knew that, I would do it. But I think that events and sort of community building things is a pretty good way to start. I also think these workshops are a pretty good excuse to bring together like target language and source language researchers. It'd be really cool to run one of these in parallel with sort of like research talks happening in languages, both languages. So I've been to, again, France being France, I've been to some conferences in France which are English and French. And that's been a really fun experience. I really enjoyed it. I would love more things like that in other languages as well. And then, of course, my long-term dream is like, wouldn't it be great if you, as a mathematician who is working in Basque or in Catalan or something, could just submit your paper to a journal, and that journal has actual translators who translate it and will publish a parallel comparison for you. Wouldn't that be so lovely? That would be so nice, wouldn't it? That's it. Sorry I ran so much over time. Thank you all for listening.
Yes, I mean, technically we're already on late, but I guess we can spend a few minutes to have some questions. And then we can continue the discussion informally in the lobby and when we go to our groups. I mean, this is fairly informal, so I don't know if there are some general questions.
Yeah, I guess my main question is, you spoke a lot about translating into English and all the specificities of that. And one of the things is, well, what English like, how do you think about what English you're translating into, like academic English, American English, British English? Because I mean, especially your comment on British people don't study the subjunctive. I was like, satisfy is wrong, it should be plural. Because I've still not studied the subjunctive. But people who've studied English as a second language, it's much less likely that that's an issue because they have studied the subjunctive in that context.
Yes, we do while using subjunctive.
Yeah, this is my point of like, this is a really key thing. And like, here I think is where the only answer is like this. It's a decision you have to make, but the first step is being aware that you're making this decision. And I think the decision sort of can be rephrased as again, sort of like, what is the purpose of my translation? Is the purpose of my translation to really mirror the tone and prose of the original? And that isn't always possible because different languages, it's not like there's a one-to-one translation of like how formal you're being in your language, right? But I think if you sit down and to begin with, you have these discussions about sort of like, who is my intended audience? What is the purpose of this translation? How much commentary do I want to provide? These are like questions that would help you to answer questions like this, like what type of English do you want to translate into? I think my general thing is like, I tried very hard to translate into sort of like what I've seen as English spoken in Europe. Sort of like this sort of like general mathematical English that we see within Europe, which some things, for example, one that I remember learning is I've started using the word morally in a way that I'm not sure it's used like this in English at all, but I was taught it in French where they say quite often like, you know, this theorem isn't true, but it's morally true. And when I first heard that, I was like, it has like ethics, it has like good, but like, what do you mean by this? But now I just say that because I've heard lots of people say it, right? Even though I don't say that as a native English speaker. So this is the sort of English I translate to, is the one that I've sort of like heard as the mishmash sort of thing. But this isn't perfect, right? It's like very much a choice that I've made. So it's worth sort of sitting down and thinking about these choices beforehand. But it's a choice you have to make.
Thank you very much for this talk and also your remarks about electronic means that we have. I want to tell you and everybody a little story I had 2 weeks ago. I was having an email exchange with Franz Limmermeyer. He and Pieper edited handwritten notes of Jacobi's lectures on number theory that he gave in Königsberg in the winter term 1836, 1837. So this is edited in German. And now Springer Verlag wants an English edition of this. And Franz well, we were talking about other things, but then he said, yeah, so I just got this translation of my text from Springer Verlag. It's an artificial intelligence translation. And I will just look at it, and then we can put out the book. So you made this little remark about Google Translate, saying this is more work for me than I have to. But is this really true that it's more work? So
this is a great question, and now we're at a point where different people would tell you how good software is at translation. I'm careful about what I say here. I would say there's not a correlation between how good someone says translation is and how important saying that is for their business making money. There's not a correlation there. It really depends. I've seen very varying results. And again, it depends on what the purpose of your translation is. For some people...
It's also changing, right?
It's also changing, and it's hard to keep up to date. I personally don't... So a way a lot of these sort of like LLM translation work, right, is you give it a prompt, and then you give it the thing to translate. And there's a lot of talk about like sort of prompt engineering, if you have to give it a good enough prompt to get the right thing out at the end. And what I think we're seeing is like actually the amount of specificity you need to put in a prompt to get exactly what you want out of the end, you might as well have just done it yourself at a certain point. For some things, I definitely believe in some cases it's better that there's any translation than no translation. And if a machine one is like, I don't know, maybe now like 99% accurate, whatever that might mean in the context of a translation, maybe that's good, maybe that's not. My thing is like, I actually enjoy doing translations, so for me it's a null question because if other people use it and it works for them, that's great. I don't see a threat of it sort of replacing the art of human translation, though. But interesting economical question for sure. Yeah.
One last question with Karin.
No, I wanted to comment on this because we, as historians, we may translate to give a translation to meaning, but the act of translating teaches us so much about the history. There is so much knowledge to be gained from the act of translating that it would be a waste of the historian's practice to do it automatically. You know, I have translated things from ancient Chinese into English, and this has led me to raise questions that some people in China would not raise because they would use the same characters. But when you have to translate, this leads to really raising questions that are extremely fruitful. So I think that perhaps the purpose is in the act of translating.
I think that's beautiful. I really like that. Yes, that's very true. And I definitely think it's true. Even when you see this tiny thing of like, you see the word sommet and you're like, how do I translate it? Why, like there's this interesting thing to ask of like, why in one language are these two synonyms identified and why in one language are they different? What sort of intuition is being lost or gained from using one over the other? Yeah, I think the act of translation is, I mean, my main excuse for doing translations is not to have a finished product. That's like a great thing that I get to like print and design a nice cover for or whatever. The main reason is like, I want to read that paper anyway, right? Someone else is going to come after me and want to read it anyway. I might as well leave breadcrumbs behind me as I go, sort of thing. So yeah, I think the
I'm
act.
sure that when you translate, you see more mistakes in each A than people who would simply read.
Probably, yes.
And so this shows that there is a mathematical work that is being done in
Yes.
translation that is again very precious from a mathematical viewpoint.
Yes, it's very true. Like it's quite common that I read a paper in English, I see enough words and like, especially if I'm in a rush, you know, I'm like, I don't quite pass this sentence, but like, feels true. The guy who wrote it's famous, like it's not going to be false, right? Like there's not going to be a technical mistake here. Whereas when you're doing the translation work, which is sort of taking it from a natural language, French or English, and sort of like deconstructing it into brain maths and then putting it back into, I think that's the key point, right? Is like when we translate as people, we don't go from French to English, we go French into however we understand mathematics back into English quite often. And I think that act, yeah, can teach us a lot as a community, but also just as individuals. I think translating a text is pretty good, yeah.
Well, I think that's a great point to stop here. Let's move upwards to where the coffee machine is, and we can keep discussing there and make arrangements for the translation groups. But first, let's thank Tim again.